All right, let's do this. For those of you who have joined us, we actually have covered a lot of the ground history-wise, talking about the Jamestown settlement in Virginia. The Plymouth colony will be up there visiting Boston. Talked about the heart of the Great Migration and how people started to flood the 13 colonies. And we left last time showing many of the destinations we would go over on the Freedom Trail in Boston. Has anybody been on the Freedom Trail before? Yeah, great stuff. So after that, we are actually going to be heading down to New York City. Actually, we start in Boston, we go to Plymouth, and then we go down to New York City. What a lot of people don't know about New York is it was at the heart of the Revolutionary War. We see Manhattan and all these buildings, and we're thinking Staten Island and everything, and we go, how could this even be? During this time, right before I take you to these destinations where we're going to be at, I just want to give you a little bit of this history. What was going on at the time was the French-Indian Wars. People say, why French, why Indian? But let's do this first. Here's the 13 colonies. So this is what the United States looked like for the United States. And you can see right up at the top there in Massachusetts, New Hampshire. See New York? Little slice for those of you who don't know. It's really, all of it is outward. There's just that little slice in between New Jersey and Connecticut. And so flip to the next screen. So here's an example of what's going on with the French-Indian Wars. French-Indian Wars because the powers of the world, the main superpowers, the superpowers were England, France, and Spain. Everybody wanted territory. And this was one big fight for territory. So you can see you had this whole area is smothered with Native Americans, different tribes in that. But you can see the British were pushing from this direction. New France, right? You had New England, New France was just flooded up there with French people. So they were trying to press coming down into the colonies to get more territory there. The British were pushing out that way. And at the same time, all of them were grabbing at what tribes would work with them and make them as allies. So this is why they call them the French-Indian War. Down in Virginia was Washington. You can see the different generals at the time where they were fighting, but Washington was fighting down in that area. But see, so you see 1750, 1760, 59, all of this precipitated and provided a foundation for what was to come in the Revolutionary War. And New York was at the heart of it. But I think this first clip is actually about the French-Indian Wars. So all of these are just 3-4 minutes apiece. Find the best stuff that just summarizes this, different scholars. So let's watch this first about the French and the Indian Wars. Little background.
Colonialism in America meant competition. European countries were eager to gobble up as much land as possible in the New World. Sometimes this competition turned into open warfare, and the French and Indian War is a perfect example of this. Here's a crash course of 5 things about the war to get you up to speed. North America was a big, beautiful place full of endless opportunities, and Great Britain and France each wanted a piece of the action. The British controlled their 13 colonies and were looking to expand west. The French occupied Canada and were looking to expand south. It was inevitable that they'd bump into each other, and that's exactly what happened in the Ohio River Valley, an important trading area with access to the Mississippi River. The French and Indian War marked the debut of 21-year-old George Washington, a lieutenant colonel for the militia in the British colony of Virginia. In 1754, he was ordered to protect a British fort near what is now Pittsburgh. On the way, Washington encountered a French military unit, and the two sides fought in the first battle of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Jumonville Glen. Washington was young, but he was quickly gaining the experience he would need to eventually command the Continental Army. Years of territorial scuffles turned into full-blown declarations of war in 1756. As fighting broke out, the British and French sought allies among the local Native American populations. The French were familiar with many tribes through trade and recruited the Potawatomi, Winnebago, Ojibwa, Mississauga, and the Huron, while the British turned to the Iroquois Confederacy. At first, the French were winning, a lot. They simply had more troops and better supplies than the British Army and drove them back towards the 13 colonies. But the tide turned in 1757 when British Secretary of State William Pitt took control of the war effort. Dreaming of a vast British Empire, he made it his mission to defeat the French in North America, pouring in generous funds to beef up military resources on the ground. The war ended with the French defeat at the Battle of Quebec and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British gained control of Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River. It may seem that the British made out well after all was said and done, but there was a catch. You see, William Pitt borrowed heavily to finance the French and Indian War, which left his nation in tons of debt. To make up for it, the British taxed American colonists up the wazoo. Americans didn't particularly appreciate this. Years of protests, rallies, town hall meetings, and petitions would eventually lead to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. The French and Indian War may not have had the glorious battles or fearless heroes of other great conflicts, but it was one of the most consequential wars in American history. It also opened the eyes of a young military leader to the tyranny of the British, a man who would go on to be the first American president.
Isn't that just great background information? You know, and
people in large numbers came out and joined.
It sets a context for that whole era and what we're about to see. So this next map, what it will show you, Stephen, the next map on there, if you could. So you can see from Boston, we're up there, Plymouth just below it, about 30 miles or so. And then New York, we come down around to that area. Now what you need to know as far as before we drop in New York City, there were a lot of places around New York which were hotspots of the Revolutionary War. A lot of them around the area. This next little video clip shows in the next 3 minutes just the different things that were happening around New York during that time. I love setting the context for these type of things because then it makes sense when we drop into New York City why it was the hub of so much activity. So watch this. All about what was happening in the New York area during that Revolutionary War.
July 4th, 1776 is the day the United States achieved its independence. It's an independence that would have never been realized without the courage and commitment of the men and women in the years leading up to that day and some of the bloodiest battles to get there. Built during the French and Indian War, Fort Ticonderoga's strategic position made it a prized possession during the Revolutionary War. First, the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, sneak attacked the British and captured the fort in 1775. 2 years later, the British took it back under General John Burgoyne. Battle reenactments today put you right on the front lines. A similar story is told at Crown Point State Historic Site in Crown Point. Visitors there can explore the ruins and take post at some of the lookouts of soldiers more than 200 years ago. Fort Stanwix in Oneida County is known as the Fort that never surrendered and began as a British outpost during the French and Indian War. Controlled by the Americans during the Revolution, troops from the fort took part in numerous campaigns, including repelling a 21-day siege that helped make possible the American victory at Saratoga in the fall of 1777. Saratoga National Historic Park takes you inside the Revolution as the colonists fought for independence from the Crown as the armies clashed at the Battle of Saratoga. Arguably the most important battle of the Revolution. It was this battle that renewed hopes for independence, which led to U.S. victory, thereby changing the face of the world. Inside Saratoga National at Battlefield Park, you will also see the only statue honoring Benedict Arnold, who was the hero of the battle at Saratoga. You can follow Arnold's story down the Hudson River to West Point. The site of America's future military academy was a key outpost during the Revolutionary War as it kept British ships from moving up the river. West Point also is the place where Arnold committed his treasonous act by plotting to turn the post over to the British while he served in command for the Americans. Once his plot was exposed, he switched sides officially to the British. Washington's headquarters in Newburgh serves as the nation's first publicly owned historic site. It was on this very site that George Washington made some of his most important contributions, such as rejecting the idea that he be made king and creating the badge of military merit, now named the Purple Heart, just to name a few. Head down to New York City and stand in Washington's exact footsteps when he delivered his farewell address to the officers of the Continental Army at the Fraunces Tavern. Washington's success was due in large part to his right-hand man, Alexander Hamilton, who also aided in the writing of that farewell address. Hamilton Grange in New York City is the estate of the man who founded the Federalist Party, one of the nation's first two political parties. All ages can explore the Hamilton Grange through scavenger hunts. Real moments, real life, and real stories of New York's path through history.
Isn't that amazing? Amazing how much was going on around New York during the time. Everybody say good morning, Calvin. Morning, sir. Who knows where was the first capital of the United States? New York, thank you. New York City. That was the very first capital. A lot of times we think of New York. Where did the capital move from there? Philadelphia. That's why we'll be seeing that next. And then where did it move? D.C., right. So the capital of America started in New York. Remember this place. New Amsterdam that turned into New York and New York City. At the time, there was a hubbub of stuff. Do you know that George Washington lived there? Went to church there? Thomas Jefferson lived there? Alexander Hamilton, who's got that big, theatrical thing about him, was there. So I just want to give you this couple-minute clip to show you down in New York City some of the Patriot activity that was happening in the city before I show you the historic sites we'll be seeing. Watch this.
So during the American Revolution, both the British and the Americans believed that New York City was the greatest strategic prize on the American continent. The British believed that if they could control the city and the Hudson River, they would inevitably win the war. In June of 1776, the first elements of the fleet started to arrive in the Lower Bay. And on July 2nd, the very day that Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, the British started to disembark those troops. Some 24,000 ground troops and 10,000 sailors disembarked on Staten Island, which became their base for the military campaign of 1776 to take control of New York City and the surrounding area. Now, as the summer progressed, Washington was facing an increasingly large number of British troops, Hessian auxiliaries who were brought in, and by the time the British had completed their buildup, they had enough soldiers to rival the population of Philadelphia, which was the largest American city at the time. In fact, one of the American riflemen on the Long Island shore looked out at the bay and he said, "I thought all London was afloat." Now, Washington, of course, had predicted the British strategy and had brought the American forces down from Boston during the spring. And now, as he spread his meager army, only about 19,000 men really fit for duty, spread them out across New Jersey, Manhattan, and Brooklyn, he was trying to figure out where the British would land. And ultimately, the British chose to land on Long Island first. And so what we see over the next several months is a series of ultimately failed amphibious landings and attempts to encircle the American army. And the British first attacked on western Long Island, what's now the borough of Brooklyn, in August. And on August 27th, 1776, fought the largest battle of the American Revolution. Some 10,000 Americans and 20,000 British and Hessians in the field. The British attempted to encircle the Americans on a ridge that was their outer line of defense for Brooklyn Heights, and ultimately ended up driving the Americans back to the Heights and allowed them to escape over a period of 2 days. The British failed to follow up their advantage after the battle, and on the night of August 29th, Washington was able to evacuate his 10,000 troops across the East River to Manhattan. In a second landing on September 15th, the British again tried to trap the Americans on Manhattan, but they were able to escape up the west side. Again in October, the British landed in Westchester, trying to trap the Americans on Manhattan. But after the Battle of Pelham Bay, the Americans were able to escape up to White Plains, fought the British to another standstill there on October 28th. After the Battle of White Plains, the British gave up the chase and swept back down to Manhattan to control the island and defeated the Americans in the Battle of Fort Washington on November 16th. It was a grim end to the campaign, with some 2,800 Americans taken prisoner. So on its face, the military campaign of 1776 in New York appeared to be a devastating defeat for the Americans and a humiliating series of retreats. Over time, however, it would prove to be a victory in disguise. The Americans had saved enough men to carry on the war for 7 more years. And the British, who became comfortable with their base of operations in New York City, would become sluggish and unable to move nimbly to help their generals in the field, most notably at Saratoga and at Yorktown, key turning points that helped the Americans win the war.
Find the best little documentaries. Did you like that? I know. It's so great to see what was going on in the colonies, and that's my reason for going into this. For the 56 people that are going on the tour in June, and even if you're just joining us, we're hitting the destination sites from Boston to Washington, D.C. that we will be hitting over an 8-day tour in June. But what I've given here is just some background, because a lot of times when you say Boston, people think, oh, Boston Tea Party, you know, you think of Plymouth, they go, the Pilgrims, you know, but I mean, we just have a very basic knowledge of that. When you say New York City and Brooklyn, you think of New York City and Brooklyn today and Manhattan, all these sky rises and Trump Tower, and I'm like, but this place was just proliferated with war and all of these things which set a context for it. So when we go into New York City and see places like, I'll show you them next time I need to stop. We're going to see the 9/11 site, Ground Zero. We're going to see the new Freedom Tower that'll come up in that. The Christ Chapel, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. Let's show these. So this, obviously, the remains of the trade towers that are there, and now beautiful water memorials, and that was the beginning of the Independence Tower. But here we'll be at the 9/11 Museum, a little bit like walking into the Jewish Holocaust Museum in D.C. I mean, sombering, but such an amazing tribute that's there. We will also be going to Christ Chapel. This is an amazing thing, and I'm going to talk about these next time a little bit more. Spend one more day in New York City before I go down to Philadelphia. This chapel is right across the street from the Twin Towers, or where they were. So when the buildings fell, it was the only building anywhere that was not damaged. And it is the most profound thing to sit there. And this was a chapel that George Washington and other founders went to. Trinity, which was part of the Trinity Church down the street, had burnt down. And so when they were building this, they went here, but it stood. And you stand there and you look across the street and you think, how is this even possible? But it was a place of refuge, go figure, for that. I'll be giving a little bit more of that history next time. We'll be looking at the end of the night, Empire State Building, which I believe is the next one. We'll be going to the top of that. Anybody else with me? You hate heights. Can I tell you? I went up the Eiffel Tower once with my family. They all know I hate heights. So I went up. I'm like, okay. And I go up it. I don't freak out or anything, but I look up. They're just laughing at me all the way up to the top. We get to the top. I look at them. I go, okay, goodbye. And I hit, and I'm all, get out, and I go down. That's how I feel at the top of the Empire State Building. We're going to go, what's that? Oh, she pushed the fire button. That's not, I'd panic over that. We're going to go out to the Statue of Liberty. I'll talk about that more. Ellis Island. People a lot don't know the island next to it was one of the greatest places for immigrants to come during the 1800s. Trinity Church, fighting to get there. Here is the home of a lot of the founders' graves, right down in New York City. And then we're going to finish the time going to a theater. We're going to go see a play. It actually has to do with Ground Zero and a city, is it in Canada, where the planes flew and refuge. You remember? Huh? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's where it is. And a phenomenal play. How about this theater? That's what this theater is going to look like soon. Just saying. All right. I'll pick up from there next time for those of you online. We'll stay in New York City one more day. I'll tell you some more about the Christian heritage, actually, of those places.